Good morning, everybody, and particularly poetry lovers. If anybody else has tuned in, this may not be the place for you. This is Jim Ransom with another edition of Morning Jim, and it's titled Poetic Leftovers. I'm going to read some things that I've left over, that I've avoided because of their complexity or because I didn't have them to fit into earlier programs. I couldn't make them fit for a variety of reasons. Today I'll be reading and commenting on a poem by William Butler Yeats. It's often considered the best of all of his poems. And he was an Irish poet of the late 19th and early 20th century. Many of you have heard of him, and those of you who listen to poetry for fun and are not students of poetry, I will say that he was a favorite of the famous poet W.H. Auden. And when Yeats died, his death inspired some of Auden's best poetry. So without more ado, I'm going to start off with Sailing to Byzantium. That is no country for old men. The young in one another's arms, birds in the trees, those dying generations at their song. The salmon falls, the mackerel crowded seas, fish, flesh or fowl, commend all summer long whatever is begotten, born, and dies. Caught in that sensual music, all neglect monuments of unaging intellect. An aged man is but a paltry thing, a tattered coat upon a stick. Unless soul clap its hands and sing, and louder sing for every tatter in its mortal dress. Nor is there singing school, but studying monuments of its own magnificence, and therefore I have sailed the seas and come to the holy city of Byzantium. O sages standing in God's holy fire, as in the gold mosaic of a wall, come from the holy fire, Pern and Agyre, and be the singing masters of my soul. Consume my heart away, and sick with desire and fastened to a dying animal, it knows not what it is, and gather me into the artifice of eternity. Once out of nature, I shall never take my bodily form from any natural thing, but such a form as Grecian goldsmiths make of hammered gold and gold enameling to keep a drowsy emperor awake, or set upon a golden bough to sing to lords and ladies of Byzantium of what is past, or passing, or to come. Well, when I began researching Yeats's poetry, I found that entire books have been written about that poem. Can you believe it? There's one by Helen Vendler, who spends some energy interpreting a good deal of sailing in terms of Yeats's known impotence as he aged, and he wasn't happy about it. He wasn't happy about anything about aging. At age 51, he married a young woman named Georgie Hyde Lees, and she was 24 years old. Some have thought it rather inglorious and an attempt by Yeats to restore his, quote, vigor. But who knows? I'm staying out of it. Once a friend of Yeats's, I've got to tell you this story, who knew that Yeats had visited a brothel, asked him what happened, and he said, it was terrible. It was like trying to insert an oyster into a slot machine. But I digress. Many people ask what Yeats meant when he says, "Pern and a gyre." There is a raptor in Ireland called a pern. That's not a scientific name, the common name. And gyre means to turn slowly around. Pern can also mean a kind of spindle where thread can be wound or unwound. Analysts have spent many pages, can you believe this? Trying to figure out what Yeats meant. Is that worth it? I don't think so. I think that this is what poetic criticism or analysis has come to, sadly. I would say just pick a meaning that you are satisfied with and move on. I hope you don't mind that I'm having my morning coffee today. And this is not from Starbucks. This is from Ransom Bucks. But it's good. I like it. In Yeats's poetry, there's always a tension between youth and experience. If you look at his poetry with that lens, that's enough to understand it pretty much. Let me read you a few lines back from that poem again. Excuse me. That's very good. I wish you were here with me to enjoy something like, okay, sailing to Byzantium. Even the beginning of it tells us quite a bit. He says, "That is no country for old men." It's like coming into a conversation in the middle of it. And then he goes on to say, "The young in one another's arms, birds in the trees, the salmon falls, the mackerel crowded seas, fish, flesh, or fowl, commend all summer long whatever is begotten, born, and dies. Caught in that sensual music, all neglect monuments of unaging intellect." Monuments like Yeats, maybe. And then he goes on to say, an aged man is but a paltry thing. Personally, I feel a little bit angered by that statement, but let it go. A tattered coat upon a stick. I think my coats are pretty good. Forget it. Unless soul clap its hands and sing, and louder sing for every tatter in its mortal dress, nor is there singing school but studying monuments of its own magnificence. And therefore I have sailed the seas and come to the holy city of Byzantium. I think we can see there the tension between the things of youth and the things that the old have to be interested in or want to be interested in. Once out of nature, I shall never take my bodily form from any natural thing. That's an odd statement, isn't it? He's going to turn his back on nature. And he wants to take such a form as Grecian goldsmiths make, of hammered gold and gold enameling, to keep a drowsy emperor awake, or set upon a golden bough to sing to lords and ladies of Byzantium of what is past, or passing, or to come. Well, that's very interesting. But it does, I think, if you look at the poem as a clash between youth and age, you can see what he's getting at there. Let me read you a little bit from something I scraped up on the internet about this very thing. And this author says that the initial trochae, which means the beginning of the poem, effectively emphasizes the vehemence of his refutation. In the poem, which starts out, "That is no country for old men," Yeats originally wrote "this" instead of "that," because we have copies of his original parchment, handwritten poem. Unless you're writing Yeats's biography, you don't really care about that. But it is interesting to note that later on, he didn't want people to think he was talking about Ireland, which he loved. No. That means the whole world, not this, meaning Ireland. So he's left it to the reader. Birds in the trees probably stems from the age-old proverb concerning the birds and the bees. Though birds and trees are also usually associated with spring and fecundity. What's curious, however, is that Yeats then labels these very symbols of renewal and birth. He calls them these dying generations. On the face of it, that makes little sense. Is the emotion expressed due to bitterness and envy? I think that we need to get away from trying to think about the poem as a sort of a bitter sandbox tantrum by an aging poet, and try to look at it in its larger context as the tension between the young and the old, or our own lives, the youthful part, and then the older part. Most of us can make our peace with that, but W.B. Yeats had a difficult time doing so. Okay, I'm going to switch tempo now and finish up with a poem of my own. It's a poem I've never read in public before, and it's from this book, Immortal Prairie. It is from my days as an allergist, when I was confounded, if you want to call it that, by many cases of hives, also known medically as urticaria. And sometimes they would come on people at very inopportune times. This one's called Missing the Prom. Like scattered stones or errant rolling gravel, the welts spread from that perfect tiny navel upward between the firm breasts and over her shoulders and settled between her shapely thighs like boulders in red, and besides all that, they burnt like fire. She, alarmed, repaired her to her powerful sire, who sent her forthwith to her wiser mother, who brought her in, the two of them in terrible bother, not least about the prom upcoming and the lure of her first big date. Oh, to be ravished not by a gallant lover, but by a drug unknown to cause anything other than a wholesome benefit, a headache cure. How do we tell her that this too will be passed down in legend, in laughter, and in story at the last? You may have noticed that I wrote this poem as a sonnet. And a sonnet is a perfect form of poetry, I think, because it forces the poet to condense the contents of the story very nicely and very musically into a short space, because a sonnet only allows 14 lines, and the last two are a couplet that must rhyme. How do we tell her that this too will all be passed down in legend, in laughter, and in story at the last? A bit of a footnote here. The young lady in question had taken aspirin. Believe it or not, aspirin is one of the commonest causes of urticaria or hive attacks. And she probably had the headache because of all her mothers dithering about getting her ready for the prom. But whatever it was, I think it made a good story. Sometimes awful events in our lives can be seen later as pretty funny. And the treatment I gave this lady, this young lady, was a burst of oral prednisone, which is a cortisone drug, along with a non-sedating antihistamine. And she went to the prom and had a good story to tell her descendants, I hope. That's it for this time. I hope you enjoyed this excursion. I'll be back in a week with some more poetry on Morning Jim. I'm sure you won't want to miss it. Bye now.